This is Sovereign Debt, a podcast on greening the global economy and debt sustainability. I'm your host, Jill Doshi. So hello, everyone. It's again been a very long time since our last episode, but I'm not going to make any more excuses. It's just that's the way it is these days. Life is very busy for all of us in Sovereign Debt. But today I'm very happy to have a guest who many of you know. Iolanda Fresnillo is the Policy and Advocacy Manager of Debt Justice for Eurodad, which is based in Brussels and Barcelona. And Iolanda has been working on sovereign debt and other development policy issues for many years, and recently published a very interesting report on debt swaps called Miracle or Mirage. Are debt swaps really a silver bullet? So thank you, Iolanda, for joining us.
Well, thanks to you. Hello to everyone. I've been a listener of the podcast for many months, years, for probably a couple of years. Is it?
There's a couple of years now, yeah.
A couple of years. So it's an honor to be here.
No, thank you so much for coming. Before we really get into your report, which is really going to be the kind of heart of our discussion, I just wanted to give you a moment to give us a little information, background information about Eurodad and your work there, just in more generally. Just what is Eurodad?
So Eurodad is a network. We are 60 organizations in 28 European countries, not just the European Union, but all of the geographical Europe. We work on economic justice. So we want to ensure that the financial system at the global, but particularly the European level, is democratically controlled, is environmentally sustainable, it contributes to poverty eradication, it delivers on human rights. So basically, economic justice. So we work on debt and sovereign debt, but we also work on tax and development finance, so aid, private finance, climate finance, so all these kinds of issues. And we are a CSO, so civil society organization, platform, as I said. So we do a lot of campaigning, we do a lot of advocacy, but we also do a lot of research. We like that our advocacy is based on what we intend to be rigorous research and analysis. And on that, we've been publishing several reports in the last years, on particularly on debt and climate, which is where this new report comes from. My latest report before this one was one on debt in seeds in small island developing states. Mm-hmm. We published something on ESG finance last year, on debt restructuring. Some of these reports are more addressed to policymakers, others to civil society, so the language differs from one another. But yeah, I have to say that we try to be rigorous, even if we are a civil society organization and not a research.
Your target audience then is really kind of European policymakers. Is that fair to say? So you're trying to kind of help them think through all of these different issues.
Exactly. Mainly European policymakers, both at the level of the European Union and the European countries, but also mm-hmm. at the global level. So European executive directors of the IMF and the World Bank, European delegates in the UN. So yeah, that's our main advocacy focus.
And then you personally, just how did you come, just if you want to share, if you don't worry about it, but just what is your personal journey to come to these issues of development finance?
I've always been interested, even as a student. I'm not an economist. I studied sociology. And I was always interested on economic justice or social justice issues. And I started on debt as an activist in the Jubilee 2000 campaigns. So late in the 1990s, preparing those campaigns in Spain. And then from there, we started a small NGO with some colleagues, some activists in Spain called the Debt Observatory. And it became my profession, my career, without thinking that. I've done masters after that and everything. But I'm kind of an activist that became sort of a professional. And I think that defines a lot my perspective on these issues.
No, because it's interesting because I've read, your other works and things and I've heard you speak on many webinars and in many different, kind of seminars and forums that we've been in together. And I've really sense a passion. So I was kind of curious about your background in this. And I remember those Jubilee days in the early 2000s and the late 90s. So, and that's really what led to the HIPIC program ultimately.
Exactly. We just had a meeting today that to prepare the next Jubilee, because next year the Pope declared Jubilee year, and debt relief and debt cancellation is part of that program. So let's see what happens if we can have another 2000 moment in 2025. So that's what we're working for as well.
Okay, interesting. No, well, thank you for that context. I think it's important to kind of hear where you're coming from, and well, just generally this particular conversation with you, I'm wanting to kind of bring in other voices, and I think, and we'll get to this now when we turn to the paper, but in so many different, as I was saying, kind of forums and things, you've really been presenting a very kind of different view on some of these things and challenging kind of the way people are thinking and some of the transactions that are going on, and kind of pushing us all to think a little bit more deeply and broadly about the impacts and context of what's happening. So in that spirit, I wanted to kind of turn to this paper, Miracle or Mirage, about debt swaps. And for those who haven't read it, I highly recommend going and finding it on the websites. And it gives a very good summary of the different types of debt swaps and the history of debt swaps and how they went from kind of bilateral, integral parts of a Paris Club agreement to today's very more innovative kind of market-based debt swaps with sponsors involved, et cetera. Again, to kind of give us context in this report, because it also very, very importantly takes a different view and really highlights a lot of the concerns or even criticisms of these transactions. So I'm just curious, kind of again, in terms of context, was there something in particular that prompted you to write this report? Was there a particular transaction or feedback that you were getting from your networks in civil society?
Yeah, look, there are three things that I think pushed me, particularly, not only Eurodad, but myself to do this. One is personal, because when I started working on debt, one of the first assignments that I had in the early 2000s was to follow and do some oversight of the bilateral debt swaps in my country, in Spain. So that was in the first decade of the 2000s. I published a report around 2006, 2008. It's not available anymore, luckily. But I had been following quite closely the experience of Spain. So when I saw that there was this new push of debt swaps, it's like, oh no, debt swaps again. I was hoping to avoid that once again. But then, and that's the second reason, is the network and the partners that we work with had very different views, and many were new to the debt issue, and they didn't have that history. And they usually look up for Eurodad. It's like, what should be our position in this issue? And debt swaps, should we be supporting? What is your position? And we didn't have a position as a network on debt swaps. And the reason why we didn't have a position is because the network had different positions. So civil society doesn't have a monolithic position in all of the issues, and debt swaps was one of those issues. So the first trigger was to try to have a sort of a discussion paper or a discussion process that ended up with a paper. The deal that triggered this was Belize. We published a critical article on the deal with Belize, and that triggered many questions from our members and partners. And we decided to, we need to work with this in a more comprehensive, again, rigorous and inclusive way. That was 2021. I think Belize, was 2021.
Yeah, it was and I think it was November 2021 that it actually closed.
And we proposed this discussion paper, but it has taken us 2 years to finalize because of many things. But then it was the Ecuadorian case that pushed us like, okay, we need to do this. We need to close this process because the Ecuadorian case triggered quite some reaction from our partners in Ecuador and in Latin America in general. So we felt we needed to push this. So the process has been interviews with experts, literature review, but also survey and interview with many civil society organizations. And the attempt is to try to have not a civil society joint position, but to reflect on those different positions in the paper.
No, it makes, a lot of sense. And I can imagine as you're writing this, you're kind of running after the market because it's been very active 2 years. So it wasn't, Belize kind of kicked off a whole host of activities. And I'm probably to blame for some of that as well with this podcast.
I had it almost finished when the Gabon deal came out. I was like, oh no,
right.
I need to include this one now.
Knowing you and having read the report, I think we can all kind of agree that the main objective of all of our activities is to try to make these transactions as effective and as fair, transparent, and good, and ultimately delivering relief and outcomes, ideally, right? Can we agree on that?
Yeah. One of the things that we discuss with some of our partners is like, let's come out with principles that we all agree on what could be a good debt swap. So how these transactions can become better. But also, one of the main motivations was also to be clear on what these transactions are able to deliver. So we were quite worried about the focus that they were getting as in some forums as a solution or as a way forward from the debt problems that many countries are facing. Because we had seen in the past, and we are seeing that while swaps can be useful when designed to free up fiscal resources, they are not so efficient to address debt sustainability problems, or they are not efficient to address debt sustainability problems. And I think there is an agreement in both the private, institutional, and civil society sectors about that. But they are being presented like that in many forums. And that kind of distraction to more substantial discussions around what needs to be done in the debt front was something that was quite concerning for us.
Well, and I think as we get into this, and we're going to pivot in a second, just, to all of the various concerns, but I think that's exactly it. But just at the kind of the top level, the devil's in the detail in all of this, right? And I think even as we talk about just debt swaps as a catch-all term, as you've done in your paper, there are different types of debt swaps. But even within the kind of, let's say, the modern, contemporary, market-based, assisted buyback type of debt swap, even those are not all of the same variety. So there's a big difference between Belize and Ecuador that might have been facing, as you say, kind of debt distress, or in the case of Belize, complete default in negotiations with creditors, versus kind of the Gabon, Barbados, kind of more liability management and taking advantage of an opportunity. And the rating agencies have seen those swaps differently as well. So I think kind of as we talk, we ourselves always have to be careful that we don't kind of lump it all together either, right? But I hear you in the sense that it's not, to answer your question in your title, it's not a silver bullet. You're not going to save or change completely or reestablish debt sustainability solely through debt swaps.
Exactly. And making distinction between first the different situations in the different countries, but also about the different types of debt swaps, because these new debt for nature swaps have nothing to do with bilateral debt swaps, or nothing to do. Don't get me wrong, they have some commonalities, but the structure.
It's a very different structure, and it's a very different different types of debt. I mean, it's the targeted debt is even at that level, it's very, very different.
Exactly.
Talking about bilateral debt, concessional debt, or just a market Eurobond.
Look, when we publish a report like this one, several of our members and partners review the report. We need to have a sign-off process with part of our membership. And one of the members came up to us saying, "You cannot this thing that happened in Ecuador. We cannot name it debt swap. It's not a debt swap." So they were like confronting even the use of the label debt swap in the case of Ecuador. This is an organization that had been following bilateral debt swaps very closely and even supporting governments in doing debt swaps. It's like, this is a completely different animal. We cannot use the same language.
I think actually just in general in this marketplace, I think that's exactly true. And I think there's been a lack of imagination on all of our parts in terms of just naming these things.
Exactly.
I feel some way we just need to actually bring in another profession of like marketing, brand management people to somehow just come up with some different labels for these different types of transactions. So, or because it's really, they are very different.
I agree, and we end up using a very, very strange name in the report.
No, and then everybody had even like you were saying, you have this memory of 20 years ago, and even the IMF and World Bank have this kind of legacy, critical ideas, and one thing I'm always reminding everyone is the reason why bilateral debt swaps, kind of tapered off in the 2000s wasn't only about the transaction. It was because HIPC came along. And the debt disappeared. So if the debt is written off, you don't have to swap it, which actually is a nice little transition to like my whole next little set of questions, which is the meat of the conversation, which is, in your report, you outline a lot of the various concerns and, as I say, kind of criticisms of these transactions. And I want to kind of go through them and kind of unpack them and hear your views. And that kind of the first one or two of them are really what we're just saying right now is grants are better than debt swaps. And I think that's absolutely true. If someone can write the check, that's great. And the other one, which I kind of see is in the same light, and then we can kind of talk about it more, is debt relief is better than debt swaps. So that's kind of what we're talking about. Like HIPC was better than bilateral debt swaps because it was a write-off of the debt. I don't think anyone would take issue with that statement. That, of course, if you have a creditor of any sort, a bondholder or a bilateral creditor that's willing to just forgive the debt or write it down, that is, of course, preferable.
Yeah, absolutely. We were quite surprised, actually, when this IMF paper on debt swaps came out, and they have the same conclusions. They say something like climate conditional grants are better than debt swaps because of transaction costs, because of the time and everything. We quite agree with that paper. We normally don't agree with the IMF papers on civil society, but with that one, it was like, oh, they're saying the same as we are saying. Debt swaps can be interesting, again, when well-defined and good governance. When a country cannot have access to grants or cannot have access to concessional finance, obviously in those cases, if a country is offered a debt swap and they have been struggling to get climate finance or SDGs finance at a concessional level or non-refundable, go for it. But if you have, if the international community has to commit with development and with climate finance, what they should put on the table is grants and concessional finance, and not so much debt swaps, because they are more complicated. They have higher transaction costs. They take longer. They are more conditional. So yeah, that's our main position.
Actually, this is starting to get to the nub of it right away, which is how the nature of the financing that sovereigns have right now, the debt that they have outstanding, has fundamentally changed. So when we think back to the 2000s, it was those kind of traditional bilateral debt as well as traditional commercial debt from the commercial banks, also somewhat influenced, if not controlled by, their host country themselves, which facilitated all sorts of, negotiations. And today's debt is very hard, which then, because it is owed to the markets and owed mainly to non-traditional bilateral creditors, China being the most prominent. So therefore, that in itself complicates giving grants in large numbers. Because if these countries are so highly indebted, money is fungible. If you give big amounts of grants, right, from any source of a donor, the fear is that it's just kind of going out the door to creditors, right? So we're already before we even get into any of the other kind of dynamics of these transactions, into this world of the intercreditor, kind of an interdonor, the kind of awkwardness of the system of development finance right now.
I'm not sure about that, but because when donor countries, when developed countries deliver on either climate finance or development aid, they hardly do it in the form of budget support, which is what we would like to see. It's normally financing concrete projects or concrete policies. So the money is conditional with the countries implementing those projects, and the money is normally going directly to those investments or development projects, which is also the case of the concessional finance by the World Bank, for instance, or the MTPs. Another issue is if it's budget support, then it can be diverted to pay out existing creditors, which takes us to the problem, which is we need to solve that problem. We need to solve this outflow of resources massively, also of resources that are not going to SDGs, that are not going to climate. This is what prompted the Jubilee campaigns in the 2000s. It's like there is this huge humanitarian crisis that today is coupled with the climate crisis, and the money is going to pay back creditors in the global north. Something is wrong if this is what's happening. So we need to solve the debt problem, but countries also have to deliver on their commitments. It's not a voluntary thing. It's a commitment that developed countries have acquired under the UNFCCC in the terms of in climate finance, and under a deal from the 1970s on ODA, and they have to deliver on those commitments.
Right. So grants are still preferable in any form. Concessional finance is still preferable from any source, and then debt relief from any creditor would still be, again, kind of a very effective way of alleviating the burden.
Yeah, for us, what we call unconditional debt relief or unconditional debt cancellation is better than conditional debt relief, which is what a debt swap is, a bilateral debt swap. Bilateral debt swap is a conditional debt relief. When we think of debt for nature swaps, this new market operation, they are sort of a refinancing more than a debt relief, a refinancing in better conditions. So therefore, there is a saving. So it's a debt buyback. You normally don't do a debt buyback if you don't improve the conditions in the operation, being it called debt swap or otherwise, or just a refinancing. And then it has some kind of conditionalities in terms of you have a commitment as a borrower country to invest part of the savings in marine conservation, which is the case of the last operations. So when you have a debt sustainability problem, refinancing is not the best way forward. It's relief or it's restructuring with a write-off. So debt relief is better than debt swaps. Well, when you have a debt sustainability problem, what is better is to do a proper debt sustainability analysis and conduct a debt restructuring, and if needed, including debt write-off. So yes, debt relief. If you're lucky and you do a debt swap having or a refinancing operation having a sustainability problem, you will just push the can down the road. But if you're not happy, then you will have a bigger problem down the road.
I agree completely that if there is the possibility for a sovereign, and in fact, this is what we tell sovereigns first, is to kind of exhaust all sources of what I just call free money, the grants. Find every dime in every pocket that you can that is available for support. And then depending on, as you say, the debt sustainability analysis and kind of where the country is, they might have to just go down a road of debt restructuring and actually engagement with their creditors. I personally feel that those debt restructuring conversations, and we'll kind of maybe get to this later, can include some of these elements and some of these tools that we've been using in terms of mobilizing other areas of support or giving creditors an option to, forgive more in return for some other outcomes that is also important to them. So I don't think it necessarily has to be debt restructuring, as we did in, 2010. We can be creative about our approach to debt relief and debt restructuring, in my view. But I do agree that the transactions that we've seen, and then going back to this idea of language and how we talk about these, they are indeed liability managements, but they're liability management with the assistance of some other entity that's willing to provide the credit enhancement. And in return for that credit enhancement, in a sense, those entities and the sponsors and everybody who's involved in working with the sovereign is saying, okay, let's divert some of these or dedicate some of these savings for particular outcomes, which I think is actually kind of a creative way of getting everyone to do something new and interesting. And depending on the discount in the market, it can have an impact.
Yeah, definitely. It can have an impact. What we have been saying, for instance, to the IADB that we have been discussing with them is if you're a public multilateral organization and you're willing to offer this credit enhancement, so putting public resources in the operation, because that's what and ultimately a credit enhancement is, then you need to make sure that the governance of the deal is spotless.
Exactly, of course. Which takes us into these kind of some of your other, comments and concerns about these transactions. Well, one, I'm taking them in an order in your paper. The next one was the feasibility of scaling up debt swaps, but depends on the situation of the country. I think that one kind of makes sense also, as well as like if the country, it's going to have its own limitations depending on all sorts of things, whether it's just the kind of the bandwidth of Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment or whoever, Ministry of Health, and just handling these things, to also just the debt structure of the country. Is that what you were getting at with that one?
Yeah, but also depending on the composition of your debt. I mean, if most of your debt is bondholder debt, but it's not being traded at discount in financial markets, then you won't be able to do this. If most of your debt is multilateral, then you won't be able to do it. If most of your debt is bilateral with China, then good luck with your bilateral negotiation. So it depends on the creditor composition as well. And I think this is one of the conclusions of the European Commission report a couple of years ago. And that was one of the conclusions of that process, which is like, as European governments, we cannot push for scaling up debt swaps because there's not so much debt to swap anymore. And then to promote these credit enhancements for nature swap operations, well, there needs to be this bulk of debt being traded at a discount in the markets. It was a few years ago. That was not.
Yeah, so it really depends on the market conditions.
Exactly. So yeah, it depends on the situation of the country. Yeah. Depends on the market conditions, etc.
But then the next ones that you talk about, I think are the kind of the challenging ones. Debt swaps can lead to a loss of sovereignty. And maybe I can throw in there also this idea of the lack of transparency and accountability, just to kind of give a heads up, but we can take them one by one. I personally also see this as an issue, just to get that out there, about the sovereignty issue. I'm passionate that these sorts of transactions need to be led by the countries themselves. And it needs to be aligned with their national priorities and not just being takers of the market of, organizations that arrive with their ideas and their programs and things. And that's requiring, though, that those sovereigns have all of the understanding and have all of the tools to analyze and make all of their cost benefit analysis. But is that what you were getting at, or is there something also more?
It's the issue of country ownership, as you were saying. It needs to be aligned with the country priorities. It needs to be led by the country. It needs to be the country that says, yeah, we want this, and not just jump into an offer from an external agent. But also the loss of sovereignty also in the recent cases of debt for nature swaps is linked to the first, the role of the deal arranger. TNC is the main one in 3 of the 4 latest cases. And the doubts whether the influence of that agent will determine what conservation policy or priorities the country will need to follow, and particularly how the conservation fund governance is set up. This is an issue that our Ecuadorian partners raised in the issue of Ecuador, where the conservation fund, I think it's 51% of the votes in the board of the conservation fund are away from the Ecuadorian government. So the government doesn't have a majority to decide what conservation policies are being implemented in Ecuadorian soil, which is Galapagos. And that is problematic from a sovereignty point of view. Linked to that, in the past, there have been experiences of tied aid in bilateral swaps. So governments, Spain is one case, but the US has also done that, and Italy and other countries, which is, well, okay, I do a debt swap with this country, but then the project that you implement, there has to be a Spanish or an Italian corporation involved in implementing the project. That we have seen cases where that is happening, and that also leads to a loss of not just sovereignty, but economic efficiency. Because you're promoting the internationalization of your companies instead of the economic growth in the developing country. So there are all kinds of issues related to this country ownership dilemma that I think need to be looked at when promoting these operations.
So, in the case of some countries, in terms of these conservation funds that have been set up, I mean, that's really, I would go so far, it's a feature, not a bug, of these transactions, that the conservation funds are actually constructed offshore and not under the control of the government. But that's what you're saying, you and others have a problem with it.
Yes. Yeah, we understand if the conservation fund is the place where the destiny of the savings is going to be decided, then the lead needs to be in the local government. Obviously, it needs to have participation of local organizations, of local authorities, of indigenous communities for sure, of business organizations from the country. But the last word needs to be on the government, because otherwise you could be applying conservation policies in Ecuadorian soil against the will of the Ecuadorian government that has been democratically elected. We can like them better or worse, but it has been democratically elected. And they have the last word on what are the conservation policies that need to be implemented in the Galapagos.
Okay. I mean, it's fascinating to hear, because when I talk to others who are setting up these conservation trust funds and who have done so for a very long time, it's literally been, what they're saying is almost the exact same thing as you are, but the kind of mirror opposite, in the sense of, we have to take this out of the hands of the government in order to ensure the integrity of the projects and the programs and the deliverance of the kind of the outcome. From what I've understood from the way they're thinking about it, it's a feature, not a bug. It's not something that like accidentally happened. It's actually one of the main tenets of these transactions. So that's a really fundamental difference. And in fact, maybe we can do this in another episode, is actually have a debate. I'd love to have like you and someone from, one of these organizations that have done these spots come and debate this point with you.
Yeah, I'd like that. I guess there can be like corruption concerns or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Is like, if we put so much effort, I'm just saying what I think that they would be saying is, if we put so much effort in, and if another government, such as the United States through DFC, has supported this transaction through, the credit enhancement, and as you said, the kind of governance and accountability have to be at the highest level. So IEDB or anybody else who's involved, it's they who are actually demanding, as far as I understand, that the savings are not in the complete control of the government, that in fact, they are controlled by civil society and other stakeholders. So I just find that it's fascinating. I don't know. I'm just trying to understand the nuance.
I think another problem here is that there hasn't been a lot of transparency on who sits on the board of these funds. That's another issue. So if that is the problem, but the board is given to local communities, not just the board, but the decision making, local communities, local authorities, well, then maybe we can start a conversation. But if the final agreement needs to get the approval of a foreign international conservation foundation, then we have a problem with that.
No, that I can understand. It's just fascinating because, I want to find the best way forward, so the best transactions for the sovereigns. But I hear the other side of it is that we actually want to take this out of the kind of complete ultimate discretion of the government and actually put it into the hands of the people. So that is the local communities, it is the indigenous peoples, it is the civil society. So maybe that's the issue of just actually how we decide who controls, and how transparent and how public of a debate it is about the conservation.
Exactly.
I also see, like, if, any of these organizations, and not to name any of them, but if they come and say, oh, well, we have these lovely programs and we want to get funded, and, there's a billionaire somewhere who's funding it all, and this is a pet project for whatever reason, that's not good.
I think at some point we need to, obviously we have seen these 4 projects in Belize, Barbados, Gabon, and Ecuador. At some point we will have to analyze how these different settings have worked and evaluate and who has actually participated, and what is the quality of that participation of the local communities, and how these local communities were chosen or not chosen, or local civil society was chosen or not chosen. I think with these innovations, we're still in the very early stages, and the concern about ownership and sovereignty is more like an alarm saying, careful with this, because we have seen in the past international conservation foundations not just influencing but imposing certain ways of doing conservation in the global south in a very colonial way. So let's be alerted here, because this is a risk.
Yeah, and I see it all the time in my work, is that there is this very stark asymmetry between these globally extremely well-funded, powerful NGOs and, the sovereign governments, which are still kind of getting up to speed, and they're dealing with so many other issues, just of their normal funding and their normal development, the budget programs and everything else, that, there is an asymmetry. So it works well. I think it has the potential of working well when those NGOs are delivering the science and the support and kind of, helping, like you say, not necessarily imposing, you need to do this or that. But then that takes me to transparency, because part of the problem with the transparency, certainly with the market-based transactions, is that obviously you want to do the buyback when the discounts are great and you're going to have the most fiscal space. So you can't really talk about it because then that would move the prices. And so that's a little bit of a conundrum.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, and we're not naive in that sense, and I understand that the process previous to the debt buyback needs to be confidential, otherwise there's no saving in the operation possible. But once that is done, everything needs to shift, and this hasn't been the case. You need to disclose the information on the terms of the deals. You need to explain how the conservation fund will work. Not who will sit in the board, but how are we going to decide who sits in the board of that conservation fund? How are you going to include or consult the local communities? This kind of information is not available or was not available in all of the cases. I think with Belize and Barbados, with time, after a year had passed of the operation, we managed to gather some information.
Right.
Once the operation, the financial operation, the debt buyback is done, why don't disclose this operation, this information? In the case of Ecuador, it was local civil society that had to ask for the terms of the deals through a freedom for information petition. That's not proper way of working. We can do much better in this, and it's in the interest of everyone involved.
I agree. And then there's something that I've been saying to a lot of these different stakeholders, that if we don't improve on some of these metrics, you jeopardize the whole idea, because there will be a backlash and there will be more, kind of resistance to these ideas. But that's why it's important to kind of talk through all of this so that we know what we need to improve, and not just, we don't want to just drink the Kool-Aid and say, oh yeah, these are all great. We should have a critical eye to it.
And this is where all the rumors come in. Rumors about, what is the interest rate? There's a difference between the interest rates of the bond and the interest rate of the loan, and who's winning all this money. And then there's a rumor about someone getting very rich by this operation. If the information is not out there, that is the information that is going to be disseminated, particularly by local civil society. It's like, what just happened, and where is all this money going?
And then that's also what, as you're saying, and this kind of ties in the insufficient participation of civil society, Indigenous people, local communities. I think we've touched on that in the sense of bringing them in to the Conservation Trust Fund management, the governance, but also in the projects themselves, and so that they see a clear benefit and impact in their lives, and whether that's in all sorts of different ways. It's just supporting their livelihoods.
Yeah, exactly. And in the report, we also touch a lot about on the bilateral debt swaps in this issue, because civil society participation was a feature of bilateral debt swaps, at least with the European countries, with France, with Spain, with Italy. But it was not always a meaningful or a quality participation. It was usually a ticking the box kind of exercise. There's an excellent report by the French Platform on Debt and Development about the French program on debt swaps, with interviews with many civil society from African countries that participated in the committees of the debt swaps, and how that participation was not meaningful at all. I know from several examples in Spain how the binational committee that included civil society, both from the borrowing country and the creditor country, were just like one meeting a year with information sharing, but no possibility to providing any inputs. So our concern about the civil society participation also comes from that experience, from knowing that even in public operations, that has been a problem, a concern, likely to be repeated in private.
Well, yes and no. I think some of those failures or faults of the past, we have learned from them. And I think people, we do know that you have to, for success of particularly these types of projects and programs, if you don't have the buy-in of local communities, it's not going to work. So hopefully we've learned something and are getting better at it. Or am I just naive?
That's one of the things that I kind of question in the report, in our report, which is there hasn't been a real evaluation of the impact and ways of implementing debt swaps in the past. So when you say we have learned, people involved in operations maybe have learned about it, but we are pushing for these debt swaps without really doing a systematic evaluation.
So you need some good grad students doing some good research projects.
That's what I'm calling for.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, we have a lot of students listening to this podcast, so maybe someone will get a PhD idea. And then you've talked about also, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to have to pick this up because I do want to get to the last questions because those are my favorite. The risk of greenwashing you've mentioned, as well as legitimizing illegitimate debt. I think on that one, it's, if you're swapping debt and keeping this alive, and that kind of goes back to the very first point, like some of this debt should just be forgiven because it shouldn't have been lent in the first place. I mean, I think that's kind of the point, but I'm gonna avoid all the odious debt kind of conversations because I know that that's a.
Let me say something on the greenwashing, because I think the issue goes way beyond the debt swaps. We need to get better at regulating ESG bonds, ESG markets. And only if we get better at that, we will avoid the risk of greenwashing. And I think you and I are in the same position here. But unless there is a more structured and binding taxonomy and process on how to use the green or blue labels, there's going to be an open door to greenwashing. And some people will use it.
One of my future guests, he's already said yes, and I just have to schedule and we'll get him on here, is from ICMA. And to come and talk about all of these kind of labels and how to improve the labels and how to improve kind of the language that we use and how we can, for lack of a better word, police some of these uses.
I'll definitely listen to that. On the legitimate debt one, this is a call from civil society for many years. It's not to swap illegitimate debts because they should be cancelled, as you said. But also, it was interesting when doing the report that one of our members mentioned a proposal that they did to the Indonesian and German government many years ago on swapping the proceeds of a 1992 loan to sell ships, like warships, to Suharto dictatorship, and how they were proposing, which was clearly illegitimate debt, quite odious debt, but they were proposing to swap that for a compensation fund for the victims of the dictatorship, which was it's an interesting way of giving it another thought and rounding the proposal. I'm mentioning this because in all of the report we flag concerns, but we also try to give different positions, information about different positions of civil society, but also academia, institutions. So it's not an absolute position. We also have diversity of positions, as I said at the beginning. And in this case, I found this really interesting.
There's actually, because I've talked to, several different stakeholders, sovereigns, et cetera, about using debt swaps as a way to kind of clean up some of these murkier, less ideal situations. That's one way of kind of everyone saving face and moving on, is just to say, okay, we agree to disagree on this stuff and like what the contract meant and whether it should have or shouldn't have, but let's come up with something else creative and move forward. I can see how someone could look at it and say, oh, that's legitimizing, some debt, but it's also a way of just moving on with our lives.
I think it's interesting that it's two sides to the same problem. And I think in both ways, you can do it right or you can do it very wrong. You can legitimize an illegitimate debt, or you can use the funds for the victims of the original loan, so to speak, to simplify.
No, exactly. And so that's full circle back to, the first point is obviously just writing it off. All of these sorts of situations can be preferable, but it's not always practical. And so we have to then get creative, which takes me to kind of the last little bit that I want to talk about, and I am conscious of time. In the paper, you have a long discussion about the history of bilateral debt swaps and how, as we mentioned earlier, that they were an integral part of traditional Paris Club agreements. And we've mentioned the US, France, Germany, lots of European countries. The traditional traditional creditors had lots of programs. But the issue now is that those countries don't actually have a lot of outstanding debt. I mean, post-HIPC, the old HIPC debt was written off. There wasn't a lot of new lending in many cases. In the case of the United States, they were actually just pivoted completely to giving large grants through the Millennium Corporation. So it's just a different development model. So now but at the same time, as we talked about earlier, the debt levels in these countries are high again, but they accumulated a very different type of debt. They accumulated the market debt, and they accumulated kind of non-traditional bilateral debt, often with China and often on different types of terms, meaning collateralized, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been the kind of the crux of the common framework, is trying to bring all of these actors together, the intercreditor, particularly amongst bilateral creditors, trying to figure out how to renegotiate debt. Do you think, and we're slightly repeating something we said in the beginning, but do you think that there's a way of bringing these sorts of elements and all of the lessons learned from the past, round of debt swaps and debt relief, as well as kind of what we've been seeing lately, into our debt restructuring frameworks?
I am part of the civil society, so I have the luxury of being utopian somehow, and not necessarily being practical. I think that is more difficult for governments or for practitioners. And we have been pushing for quite some time for what we call a multilateral debt resolution legal framework under the UN. In 2015, there was a resolution at the UN. 2014, there was a resolution at the UN for a debt restructuring legal framework that was blocked at the end by the European and the US. But we think that thinking outside even the G20 and Common Framework box could open the door to more creative and new, I don't know if format or dynamics on debt restructuring. So next year, the UN is convening the fourth Financing for Development Conference, which will happen in Spain in July. And we are really hoping for this debate on the UN debt legal framework to open up towards that opportunity. We know it's unlikely for governments to approve on this, but given the lack of results of the common framework, the urgency to have solutions to that problem, but also the calls from Global South leaders like William Ruto in Kenya or Mia Mottley or many others on the need to reform the international financial architecture, and in this case, concretely, debt architecture. We think it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to think outside the box, to rethink the debt architecture, and to rethink the principles in which debt restructuring works. I do a lot of capacity buildings in people who is not familiar with the sovereign debt. And when I explain that debt restructurings almost don't have any written rules. I mean, you have the contract, that's a written rule, but you don't have like a global agreed rules on what is compatibility of treatment.
I mean, we're trying to some extent through the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable to, I wouldn't say codify, but to kind of try to at least discuss and bringing in some debtor countries as well as creditor countries and other stakeholders to actually flesh out some of these ideas and think. But I agree. There's room for creativity and a need for new solutions. And we've seen, in Portugal with Capo Verde, Belgium, Mozambique, China, even with Egypt. There are some bilateral debt swaps, and I'm sure there's dozens more that I haven't, mentioned. It seems to me, at least from my perspective, there is a spirit of trying to get creative. And the World Bank is trying to, look at sustainability linked instruments. I'm trying to, again, kind of mobilize, and everyone's talking about how do we mobilize in the private sector. But again, the debt, because the debt levels are so high, it naturally takes you to the point of liability management or debt relief, debt restructuring, some sort of exchanges, and then somehow linking those ideas to kind of outcomes, at least in my kind of where I'm sitting.
Yeah, but this is why I'm mentioning the UN discussions, and I know the UN has not the best press, but I mean with the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, the debtor countries that are in that table are the ones dealing with debt restructurings or with debt problems. Ecuador is one of them, but you're not asking to the governments that are avoiding debt restructuring, because they are not in that table. Countries that are struggling with having access to concessional finance, like Egypt or Kenya, so I think having a conversation outside the pressures of having to get China on board and deal with the pressing cases of Zambia and Ghana and others can bring in new ideas outside the box. Having the discussion with that group of countries, which are the ones that are sitting in the negotiating table in parallel to the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, I don't know. I'm not sure those countries are going to be able to speak up, particularly with borrowing countries, on no, what we need is something different. I mean, they are negotiating their future with their creditors, literally. How is this Sri Lanka going to speak up saying, this is not working for us?
But there are also, I mean, there's, and you even alluded to the Bridgetown Initiative, there's the Sovereign Debt, Sustainable Debt Coalition, there's the V20. There are different structures emerging to kind of give voice to these concerns. But I think you and I are on the same page. I mean, I do believe that there is a need to be creative and get people together. I think I just, in some ways, think actually there is at least the beginning of that conversation happening. We haven't maybe found a solution yet, but we are, I think, consensus is emerging that there is this problem and that there might be some way forward of this. We don't have all the solutions yet.
Yeah, I agree on that.
Well, like I said, I've taken up a huge amount of your time. My last question is kind of a tradition here, which is you get the last word. And generally, I just ask every guest of what would you say to the debt managers that are facing these challenges, that are looking at debt swaps or any of these other kind of transactions linked to SDGs or climate nature? What would you like to tell them?
Look, the first thing I would tell them is first to run their own DSA, their own debt sustainability analysis, and see with their own data and their financing needs, what is it that they really need? If it's a debt swap or it's a debt restructuring or it's a refinancing, or what is it that they need? And to do that with their own metrics. And I think supporting countries to run their own DSAs would also empower them in these situations, and collaborate with other borrowing countries. I am very happy to see these initiatives around the borrowers clubs. So borrowers, debtor countries coming together to coordinate strategies, to share information, to share tactics. Even creditors do that in the Paris Club. They do that everywhere. Why shouldn't debtor countries do the same? And I think talk to the ones that have done the debt swap before. Talk to the ones that have refused the debt swap. And come to your own conclusion, but not only listen to the creditors or the international organizations pushing for this. So I think there needs to be much more collaboration and discussion among borrowing countries.
I think that's a very good point, this kind of peer-to-peer learning.
Exactly. Also on financing, I mean, how did you do to issue that green bond? How is it working, or that sustainability linked bond? Or how are you getting back to market or not? How are you dealing with the IMF program? I think, yeah, borrowing countries could really improve their position, because it's a power relation, and there's a lot of asymmetry in information and in power. And this idea of the borrowers club could re-equilibrate that asymmetry.
No, I think it's a really important point. Thank you so much, Iolanda. It's really been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for taking the time to explain your report and your views, and best of luck, and keep going, keep pushing all of us to do better.
Thanks to you. Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun. And as you can see, I'm passionate about talking about these issues. So always happy to do that.
It's wonderful. No, thank you. Thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a review and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts.